What I like to use for wheel bearings, U-joints, chassis lubrication, etc. is Mobile One synthetic grease, and over here it shows a list of those things that it's designed to be working with. So I'm going to show how I pack wheel bearings old school. New school, we have tools, and you can fill that tool full of grease, put it around the wheel bearing and pump away, and next thing you know, the wheel bearing is packed. It works. But what I like to do is get close to the cars I'm working with. So here's the inner wheel bearing. I already have the race out of the package. I've also cleaned my hands. Anybody who saw my hands a few moments ago in this video will recognize these aren't greasy and grimy. I'm not worried about grease and grime. My concern is in that grease grime, any suspended material. For instance, when this outer wheel bearing failed, there's no doubt that the grease inside that hub with the old rotor got contaminated with a lot of small pieces of metal. Okay, so here's the bearing. It's dry. I can spin it pretty easily. So now what I'll do, I have this open. I'm going to get a small glob of this grease, and anybody who doesn't want to get grease on their hands and do work like this, you do not belong in automotive repair. This is part of what it takes sometimes. And I'll turn toward Lynda a bit more so she can see more of what I'm doing. So now the idea is to press this grease into this opening where the cage holding the rollers is separated from the inner race, and just push it through until grease starts coming through where the bearings are. I'll do it around the whole circumference of the bearing. Once I see that grease has been coming through, then I know that it is packed. You can see some of that coming through right now between those rollers. Meantime, on the inside, some of the grease got moved in there, so I just pulled it back out, put it back in the palm of my hand. Now, if you look at the top, you see where the grease is coming out the top of those races, the rollers. That is packed. When I'm done, I will put grease around the outside circumference of those tapered rollers. But right now, I just want to get it up inside between those rollers. Nice and easy. There's no rushing this. It just takes a little bit of time and persistence. But eventually, it will all start to pop. There's some of the inner bearing race. I can just put that grease back in my hand. I'll keep going. I'm hoping that the video is picking this up nicely. For folks that are new to this technique, it'll take a little while to maybe get a feel for it. But once you get a feel for it, it's like riding a bicycle you'll never forget, or more appropriately, it's like shifting a manual transmission, rowing a boat. Once you learn how to do it, it becomes very easy. And it doesn't take a whole big gob of grease to do this either. Okay, I've used up most of the grease. I'm going to inspect and make sure that I have it down where I want it. And there's a spot. I wouldn't say I missed. I just don't think it's complete as it could be. There we go. And now I'll just coat the outside of these rollers, just so I have a little more grease in there for its initial lubrication. The last thing you want to do with hardened steel rollers like this and the hardened steel races, inside and outside races, is have any kind of weight of the vehicle putting pressure on those rollers when there isn't adequate lubrication. It will destroy them very quickly. But properly lubricated with persistent grease that's not going to get warm or run off and get liquidy, these things can literally last longer than the car, unless they're over tightened. Okay, so now I just drop this down on the race. No need for me to worry about tightening it or anything else. That'll happen when I tighten the outside spindle washer nut against the outer wheel bearing. It'll press this onto where it's supposed to go on the spindle, and it'll snug it up nice and tight as it's supposed to. I say nice and tight. That's not very tight at all. I'll go over that when I start going into the outer wheel bearing assembly and putting the rotor in place. That won't be for a little while. Meantime, I'm gonna put a little grease around that part of the spindle where the grease seal normally sits. And I'm also going to, once I have the grease seal in place, put a little grease on the inner lip of the grease seal. It shouldn't go on dry. It should have a little bit of grease, not much. It doesn't take much at all, but I want to give it every opportunity to not have any seepage or leakage or weeping of grease. Okay, I'm going to have Lynda cut this while I clean up and prepare the spindle for the outer bearing. I'm going to jump forward a little bit from where I thought I would, and I'm going to put this inner bearing grease seal in place after all. Very simple part. It has a plastic coating around where the interference fit is into the rotor, and it acts like a seal, but the real seal I am concerned about is this part right here. It's called a lip seal, and it does two things. First, it keeps the grease from coming out. Just as important, it seals against water coming in. Now, I don't know where my grease seal driver is, so I'm going to go ahead and tap this in place by hand carefully with a ball peen hammer. Now, I have some grease I slopped up here about where I'm going to be installing it. It doesn't have to be there, but it also doesn't hurt. I just want to get it off of that one surface a little bit. If I end up damaging this as it's going in, shame on me. I'll go look for the grease seal driver then, and I'll be embarrassed to have folks seeing it happened. I can tell I'm going the right way because there's a lip up here that stays on the outside. This goes to the inside of the rotor.
And it doesn't go all the way in, just flat?
Just a little bit at a time. Very light tap. And now I'm feeling to see if it went in all the way. Almost. That feels pretty good. See if I got my fingernail in between that lip and the rotor on that inner surface. If I can, then I gotta bring it down a little bit further. And it was making a lot more racket then would be indicative of how much hammering I was doing. It just sounded like I was hitting it hard. Now I'm going to go around the whole thing one more time lightly. Move the hammer out of the way. Take a little bit of this grease from inside and just lightly put it in where that seal lip is on the inside. It takes very, very little. And pretty much anytime you see a lip seal like that, it needs to have some kind of lubrication in order to make sure that it works properly. Now, I've already put some grease around where the seal is going to go on this spindle. Now I've got to be careful, keep my hands fairly grease-free so I don't touch rotor braking surfaces. If I do, I clean it off before I start using the brakes and before I put the pads on. We don't want grease or oil or any other contaminant to get on the pad surfaces or the rotor surfaces needlessly. If you look between the inner race and this cage, you'll see the red grease just starting to come through the very top of those roller bearings. So they've all been packed all the way around. I got my big thumb and fingers in this part you can't see, but this is the last part that I packed right in here. And so now I'm going to pack it down the other way a little tiny bit, and then this is packed properly. It takes a little bit of time. Some folks don't like the way the grease feels in their palm. Okay, now that's packed. I put this in place, slide it back. Now, it's time to get the inner wheel bearing, which I dropped but it stayed in the box, so it's clean. I have Lynda dump it on my hands carefully. I'm holding it by the inside, slide it in place, and there we go. Okay. Next, I could reuse the old washer. They included a new one, so I'll use it. Spindle nut. I'll get it slightly turned in first before I start to tighten it down. Let's see if I can catch a thread. There we go. So I'm going to rotate this as I tighten it down. What this does, it helps to seat the inner and outer wheel bearings while having the rollers work their magic in reducing the friction. Seating the bearings is pretty important, and that's why Ford says to torque it down 17 to 25 pounds. Now I could go ahead and get a big socket, put this on my torque wrench and show you it's between 17 and 25 pounds. But I can tell you from my experience, I have it right where it needs to be. So now I'll back it off. A little bit. And then Ford says, tighten it finger tight. I've done that. It's finger tight. Now for the castle nut cover. Now these things are cut, so if I don't get things lined up quite right the first time, I can pick it up and drop it in place a little bit further out until I finally get it. That seems to be what I want. We'll see. Cotter pin is being a real pain. There we go. Here we are. Same thing as before. I want to go and spread these and do it in such a manner that whoever works on this next doesn't end up getting perforated by one of these two tails. No reason I can't be nice about this. No reason not to be considerate. Okay. Now, I need to find the spindle dust cover. I could use the old one, but we bought new ones just so it'd be nice and shiny looking. That's one of them. I could put this on after I put the brakes together, but since I'm right here, I can do it here. That feels like it's gonna fit. It's an interference fit with soft metal, and the way to get it in place is to use a small hammer some of that edge is catching. Okay, it took a little bit of persuasion, and now it's in place. The rotor turns nice and easy. The bearings are seated. I'm satisfied that we're this far.